Imagine for a moment a man with supernatural strength, someone so powerful that he could defeat entire armies, destroy enemies with his own hands, and be the hero of a people. Now stop and think. How could it be possible for this man, so strong, to be defeated by something as simple and common as a feeling? This man is Samson, the strongest man in the Bible, but also the man who made himself vulnerable to passion. Welcome to the Gold Bible channel. In today's video, we're going to explore the life of Samson, a man of incredible strength who was ultimately brought down by one of the most powerful emotions, passion. His story shows us the consequences of giving in to our weaknesses and how, even in our lowest moments, God can still have a redemptive purpose. Have you ever felt vulnerable to something you knew, deep down, you shouldn't give in to? Then this video is for you. The story of Samson begins in an extraordinary way, even before his birth. Imagine the impact of the promise made to his parents. The angel of the Lord appeared to Samson's mother and brought her a powerful message. She would give birth to a son who would be consecrated to God from the womb. He would be a Nazirite, Judges chapter 13, verses 2-5, completely dedicated to the Lord. The Nazirite vow required that Samson remain pure. No cutting of his hair, no drinking wine, no consuming anything impure. He was called to be a separated man with a grand mission ahead. Even more important, Samson's mission was of utmost significance to Israel. He was chosen to free God's people from the oppression of the Philistines, a people who had subjugated Israel for years. God's promise to Samson was not merely a simple privilege, but an immense responsibility. Before he was born, he was chosen for something great, to fulfill the divine plan. This promise, made before his birth, clearly demonstrates the magnitude of the mission Samson would have. It wasn't just a mission of physical strength, but of obedience and consecration to God. What does this make us reflect on? How many of us have been called by God to live something great, to fulfill a purpose? What are we doing with God's calling in our lives? Are we living according to the plans He has for us? Or are we letting ourselves be distracted by the temptations and distractions of the world? Samson was called to be more than just a strong man. He was called to be a leader, a liberator, an instrument in the hands of God. And just like him, you too were created with a divine purpose. What are you doing with the plan that God has for your life? As Samson grows, the strength God gave him begins to manifest in extraordinary ways. But along with it, his vulnerabilities begin to emerge. Although he was consecrated to God from the womb, he starts to approach a world that was in total contradiction to the divine plan for him. Samson, the man chosen by God, falls in love with a Philistine woman, something his parents deeply disapproved of because the Philistines were enemies of Israel. Judges chapter 14, verses 1-3. Here, we see for the first time how Samson begins to stray from his purpose. He, with all his strength and divine potential, finds himself drawn to something that, deep down, was not in line with God's plans. Samson's passion for this woman not only goes against the values of his people, but also pulls him away from the purpose he was created for. This moment reveals the human fragility we all carry. No matter how strong we are, our emotions often blind us to what's best for us. How many times do we find ourselves making decisions based on our desires or passions, without considering if those choices are in line with God's plan? Have you ever stopped to reflect that some choices might take us away from divine purpose, even when they seem harmless or natural? How have you allowed your passions and desires to guide your life? Are your choices aligned with God's will for you? And so, we see how Samson, even though chosen and consecrated by God, begins to take steps in the wrong direction. His heart was attracted to something he shouldn't have, and this marked the beginning of the struggle between what he wanted and what God wanted for him. Now let's follow how this attraction would lead him to even more complicated choices. When Samson married the Philistine woman, complications began to arise unexpectedly. The wedding celebration, which should have been a celebration of love, soon turned into an emotional battleground. During the party, Samson posed a riddle to the guests, something that seemed harmless. But as the celebration went on, he began to feel the tension grow. His wife, pressured by the Philistines, ended up revealing the answer to the riddle, betraying Samson's trust. This was the first major sign that Samson was being carried away by passion, and at the same time was beginning to lose control of the situations around him. Judges chapter 14, verses 10 to 19. Here we see a bitter truth about human passions. When they are not guided by wisdom, they can lead us to choices that cause pain and betrayal. Samson, in his heart, wanted to believe that he could trust his wife, but he failed to notice the manipulations that were happening around him. He trusted her blindly, but he was not paying attention to the warning signs. His passion blinded him to the danger coming toward him. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you trusted someone blindly and were disappointed? Sometimes our vision gets blurred when we are overtaken by emotion. This leads us to act without realizing the risks and manipulations that may be surrounding us. How can we learn to trust more in God and less in our emotions? Are we being guided by divine wisdom, or are we blindly surrendering to our feelings, just like Samson? In response to his wife's betrayal, Samson seeks revenge. But instead of finding a balanced solution, he makes an impulsive and violent decision that only increases the conflicts. In an act of desperation, he releases foxes with torches tied to their tails, burning the Philistines' crops. Judges chapter 15, verses 1 to 5. This rash reaction does not bring peace to Samson. On the contrary, it only creates more violence and pain, both for him and for those around him. Revenge is a response that often we feel in our hearts when we are hurt or betrayed. It seems like a way to restore justice and relieve the pain we feel. But in reality, it only perpetuates the cycle of anger and suffering. Samson, in his pain, thought he was solving the situation, but his revenge only escalated the violence, causing more destruction. Have you ever found yourself acting impulsively, driven by anger or a desire for retaliation? How do you handle the negative feelings that arise when facing injustice or betrayal? The Bible teaches us that revenge is not the way to peace. Instead, we must learn to forgive, trust in God to deal with injustices, and seek self-control. What does the Bible say about forgiveness and how we can find true peace, even when anger tries to dominate our hearts? Samson's story takes a drastic turn when Delilah enters the scene. She was a Philistine woman hired by the Philistines to discover the secret of Samson's strength. And here we see the turning point in Samson's life. His passion becomes his greatest weakness. He falls in love with Delilah, and blinded by love, he ends up revealing to her the secret that made him invincible. His hair, which should never have been cut due to his Nazirite vow, Judges chapter 16, verses 4 to 6. Delilah, with her beauty and manipulation, seduces Samson, causing him to surrender the most precious secret of his life. What should have been a relationship of love and respect turns into a deadly trap. Samson's passion, which should have been a blessing, ends up becoming his greatest vulnerability. He trusted someone who did not deserve his trust, and this led to his destruction. Have you ever reflected on the relationships you have cultivated? Could it be that some passions, no matter how intense and real they seem, can steer us away from the path that God has prepared for us? Sometimes, we give ourselves so completely to something or someone that we become blind to the dangers around us. How can we discern whether we are being guided by true love or by a selfish desire that could pull us away from God? Finally, the decisive moment comes. Delilah, seducing and manipulating Samson, cuts his hair while he sleeps. This simple but devastating act was the point of no return. Samson, unaware of the gravity of what was happening, fully trusted Delilah, and she handed his secret to the Philistines. Judges chapter 16, verses 17 to 19. With his hair cut, Samson lost the supernatural strength that God had given him. Without his strength, he was captured by the Philistines, blinded and humiliated. The man who once was invincible was now a prisoner, forced to grind grain, performing the work of a slave, an act representing the lowest point of his life. Here, we see the great lesson from Samson. When we distance ourselves from God, whether through our passions, our choices, or a lack of spiritual vigilance, we lose the strength that only He can give. Samson's strength was not in his appearance or muscles, but in his consecration to God. When he gave away the secret of his strength, he didn't just lose his hair, but his connection with God. And that is what truly weakened him. Have you ever felt that at some point in life, your strength disappeared? How can you reconnect with God when you feel lost or directionless? Sometimes, difficulties and pain come to remind us of our complete dependence on God, and not on what we have or can do for ourselves. Let's now explore what happened to Samson while he was in prison. Samson was publicly humiliated by the Philistines. The enemies of Israel now saw him as a mere prisoner, without strength, without honor. He was taken to a prison, where in addition to being physically subdued, he had to perform the most humiliating task, grinding grain, a job reserved for slaves. Even amid the pain and humiliation, Samson did not lose all hope. The prison, though a true test of his fall, was also a moment of deep reflection. He knew that his defeat was not only physical, but spiritual. He had distanced himself from God, and that was the true cause of his fall. Samson's reflection on his situation represents a crucial turning point. As he reflected on his choices and the cause of his fall, Samson began to realize that his loss of power was directly linked to the loss of his connection with God. What he had lost was not just his physical strength, but the presence of God in his life. Sometimes we also experience moments of humiliation and pain, where it seems like everything we've built has crumbled. But what we need to understand is that even these moments of loss can become an opportunity to return to God. How do you face the difficult moments in your life? Have you ever gone through times when the pain seemed to consume everything? But upon reflection, you realized that God was calling you back to restore what was lost? Sometimes the loss of power gives us the chance to find a greater strength that comes directly from God. Now, let's see how Samson's story will take a new turn. Now, after a long journey marked by falls and failures, Samson finds his last chance for glory. Even in his humiliation, without his sight and physical strength, he cries out to God for one final act of power. He is in the Philistine temple, surrounded by the enemies of Israel, and is mocked and ridiculed as a mere prisoner. But even in the face of this humiliation, Samson, deep in his heart, recognizes that his true strength has always come from God, and only He can restore it. He cries out to God, saying, "Lord, remember me," and with that his strength is restored. Samson uses his last strength to collapse the temple columns, causing it to fall and killing more Philistines in his death than he had in his entire life. Judges chapter 16, verses 28 to 30. This final act of Samson is not only a physical victory over his enemies, but a powerful demonstration of God's grace and mercy. Even after all his failures, God offers Samson an opportunity for redemption so he can fulfill the purpose he was created for. And this leads us to reflect. How many times in our own lives have we felt like we've failed irreparably? And yet, God offers a chance for restoration. How have you experienced God's mercy in your life? How does this mercy motivate you to live for His glory, even after your failures? Even when our falls seem final, Samson's story teaches us that there is always an opportunity to return to God, to be restored, and to fulfill the purpose he has for us. Now let's move on to the lesson this story leaves us. The story of Samson teaches us many profound lessons, but one of the most important is about the danger of uncontrolled passion. Samson, the physically strongest man, was defeated not by external enemies or battles, but by the destructive power of his own passion. He fell in love with Delilah, a woman who betrayed him, and this passion blinded Samson to the true dangers she represented. His lack of discernment, his inability to perceive Delilah's intentions, led him to trust her blindly, revealing to her the secret of his strength. Passion, when not guided by wisdom, can lead us to make choices that distance us from God and our purpose. Samson, in his emotional blindness, surrendered to reckless love, and that was the moment his true vulnerability was exposed. Passion, without the filter of wisdom and spiritual discernment, can weaken our inner strength and lead us off the path that God has planned for us. Have you ever stopped to reflect on the relationships and passions you cultivate? Have you ever, at some point in your life, given yourself to something or someone without listening to God's voice? How can we prevent our passions from becoming traps that lead us away from divine purpose? Samson's story is a clear warning. Love without wisdom, passion without discernment, can lead us to make choices that pull us away from God and rob us of the strength He gave us. True strength comes from a heart aligned with God's will. Now, as we reflect on this lesson from Samson, we ask ourselves, in what areas of my life am I being guided by my passions instead of being guided by divine wisdom? At the end of his life, Samson's legacy is not only about his victories, but also about his failures. He was a man of supernatural strength, but also of human weaknesses. His life was marked by great feats, but also by reckless choices and devastating consequences. What stands out, however, is the opportunity for redemption that he had, even after so many failures. Samson, sacrificing himself at the end of his life, fulfills the mission he was given, defeating the Philistines and liberating Israel. This final act, though tragic, was a demonstration of God's grace in action. Even when it seemed too late, God used Samson's life for a greater purpose. His story is a great lesson about how God can restore our lives, even when we think we have failed too much. Have you ever felt that at some points you've made so many mistakes that there's no way back? Samson's story teaches us that we are never too far from God's grace. Even in our failures, He can use us to fulfill His purposes. What do you think? How do you view the possibility of redemption in your own life? And so, we come to the end of this deep reflection on the life of Samson. His story is undoubtedly a powerful reminder that no matter how strong we are, there is always the possibility of being defeated by our own emotional weaknesses. Passion, when uncontrolled, can lead us away from God's purpose and leave us vulnerable to the dangers around us. However, Samson's story also teaches us that even in the deepest falls, God is a God of redemption, always ready to restore those who turn to Him. Have you ever felt lost or vulnerable at some point in your life? Samson's story shows us that even when we think our strength is gone, we can always cry out to God, and He can restore our strength. True strength, the kind that comes from God, does not depend on external circumstances, but on our connection with Him. I invite you to reflect on your own life. What passions or decisions have guided your journey? Have you been listening to God's voice or been led by momentary emotions? May we learn from Samson's life to avoid the dangers of runaway passion and always seek divine wisdom in our choices. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe to the Gold Bible channel, leave a like, and share it with friends who could be blessed by this message. And make sure to turn on the notification bell so you never miss our upcoming videos, each one filled with teachings that bring us closer to God. See you in the next video.